We're going to have standing room only, it looks like, so come on in and take your seat, and please, if you would, turn your cell phones off. You do?
Yeah.
What's his number? 27. Please turn your phones off if you would, and okay. We have a court. We have an up here.
We have a form, yeah.
All right.
I'm counting.
All right, if everyone would, I'd like to ask Howard Maxwell if he would please open our meeting with prayer.
All right, let's pray. Lord, we do thank you again for this day. Thank you for the breath of life. Lord, we just thank you for the men and women that have come to this meeting to take care of the business of our state. Lord, we just pray that you'll bless us with wisdom and guidance as we deliberate these issues coming before us. Thank you for your goodness and your mercy. Lord, just bless us in all that we do. Thank you for this great state. Go with us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. As always, we like to do in this committee. Any teachers or students here, would you please stand up? Last week we had a whole Mercer class we didn't recognize. We welcome all you teachers. Let me see you. We're proud of you. That's what it's all about. We appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. All right. What we plan to do today now, all of you who were here Friday know we had a 3-hour hearing. We stated at that time we took lots of testimony, we took a lot of recommendations, and we instructed everyone who had a concern, a recommendation, to meet with the governor's staff, to meet with Representative Comer, which they did, I assume. I know you had a stack of recommendations, Representative, isn't that true? And they have been meeting. We told you we would send the information out, which we have been doing, and we put in your folder, all members of the committee, you'll find the Senate bill, the substitute we're going to be working with today, LC 336176-ECS. It has been placed on the website. It's been out there for those to look at. We've had lots of comments, and so today, as I said, there will be only the committee will be able to ask questions. If anyone in the audience wants to speak with anyone on the committee, we have a very strict policy here. You must come over to my left, your right. Sheena, right there, raise your hand. She will come down and take your note and deliver it to the committee member if you must do that. We ask that you not unless you feel like you must. But the only ones that will be allowed to present today and the only ones that will be able to ask questions will be the committee members, and the presenter of the bill will be presenting the bill. So without any further delay, we'd like to ask our presenter, if he would at this time. It would be presenting Senate Bill 133 and Senate Resolution 287 by Representative Christian Coomer. Representative Coomer, what order do you want to go and how do you want to proceed? Go ahead. And introduce who you have with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have Erin Hames from the governor's office with me today. She was here with me last week. And what I'd like to do is give you a few very brief remarks and then move on and explain the changes to SB 133 that you'll find in LC 336176 ECS, and then stand for any other questions that the committee may have, if that's all right. Yes. Okay.
That'll be fine. Okay.
Thank you. First and foremost, Mr. Chairman, I want to recognize. Thank you. I want to recognize something and really draw attention to something we haven't talked about a lot in this committee and through this process, and that is there are over 110,000 public school teachers in Georgia, and I am utterly, thoroughly convinced that the vast majority of them are really slogging away in our schools, doing the very best they can to make sure that the children in those schools have the greatest education, the broadest scope of opportunities and experiences they can possibly get in our system, in our school systems. And I truthfully believe most of those teachers, even the ones that are in schools that are falling behind by these measures, really want what is best for their students that they care for. And so I want to start off from that perspective, that what we're doing here is really not about trying to point the finger at anybody or lay blame on any person or any group of people. It's really about trying to figure out what is the best method, process, tool, opportunity for making sure that most students who are now in those systems, in those particular schools that are falling behind, have the opportunity for a good basic quality education. I don't want that to be lost on any of the members either. I will explain some of the changes, or I'll try to explain all the changes we have in the substitute. And I want to thank the members of this committee, all the members of the House of Representatives, interested community partners who have had a lot of feedback, a lot of input, and whose thoughts we've incorporated into this substitute. In particular, I have to say thank you to Chairman Dixon, who spent a lot of time with us working through this process up until the moments this committee started its meeting, trying to make sure we have
tonight, right?
Yeah, we'll probably keep on working all through the night. Absolutely. But you know, we've had ongoing discussions with members of both caucuses, and I'm proud to say that what we're working toward and what we're producing is a real collaborative product that has a lot of input from a lot of different people, a lot of ideas, a lot of concerns, a lot of thoughts that have been expressed, and I think they make for a better bill. So let me jump right into the changes. One of the issues we heard last week, and we've been hearing, is that there was a problem with the nomenclature. People didn't like the idea that we were going to label a school or a group of students as being in a failing status. And in fairness, there really was only one place in the substance of the bill that used the word failing to describe a school, and that was on line 4 of the bill. We've changed that language to use the word qualifying, because that's actually the technical term of art we're using throughout the bill. So we're changing a description of schools that are failing to schools that are qualifying under this code section. Moving on, lines 8 through 10, we have inserted. I'm sorry. I'm speaking a little bit out of turn, Mr. Chairman. The word failing does appear at line 4, and it appears in a few other places in introductory language, but it only appears one time in the substantive bill that we presented, and I believe that would have been at line 40, not line 4. So that was at line 40 where we changed failing to qualifying. So that's the first response. Then also, at line 53, we have inserted the words on all aspects of operation. And on lines 54 and 55, we've added the report shall also be published on the office website. What the intent of that is to create more openness, more transparency, and more opportunity for public involvement, public feedback in the process. Moving on to the next section on page 3 of the bill, we've added a couple of different changes here. Lines 60 and 61, we've added the sentence, the schools selected for inclusion in the OSD should represent geographic diversity, including urban and rural schools. Line 63, we've added the words most recent before the words 3-year period, so that we're clarifying that the performance that's being analyzed will be the 3 most recent years before the analysis takes place. Line 65 through 66, we've added the words current turnaround efforts, and that again is to focus OSD on what is most important in making a selection, and that is if a system is currently making efforts to have a school increase its standing, then we want to recognize that in the selection process and make that school one that would be less likely to be picked up. Lines 68 and 69, we've cleaned up the language a little bit without really changing the meaning, where we say that the final selection of which schools are transferred into the OSD shall be in the sole discretion of the OSD superintendent. Let's see, line 83, again, we've inserted the requirement that the information be published on the office website. Line 98, we have reiterated language that you find at line 98 in a couple of different sections of the bill. It basically says that the schools are to remain open to the enrollment in the same manner with the same attendance zone as before any waiver request was made. Line 98 also, we've added that all opportunity schools shall comply with all applicable constitutional and statutory non-discrimination requirements. In section that's labeled 20-14-105, beginning at line 149, again, that's the keeping the same enrollment in the same manner with the same attendance zone prior to becoming an opportunity school. At lines 153 and 154, we've added some additional clarifying language that says that the opportunity school shall solicit and preferentially consider qualified local contractors and service providers to give a preference for local contractors. That's line 153 and 154. Lines 160 and 161, we've added that the Board of Education, the local Board of Education, shall be required to make immediately available to the opportunity school at no cost student records for all students of that school. The reason we added that is based on feedback we'd heard from other states where that had become a problem, where the local board had not been willing to deliver the records of the students, which obviously created problems for those students. Lines 162 through 169. We've added a new subsection F. I'm sorry? Okay. It says opportunity schools shall develop and provide for positive behavioral interventions and supports, which means an evidence-based, data-driven framework to reduce the disciplinary incidents, increase the school's sense of safety, and support improved academic outcomes through a multi-tiered approach using disciplinary data and principles of behavior analysis to develop school-wide targeted and individualized interventions and supports. Additionally, opportunity schools shall develop and provide for response to intervention, which means a framework of identifying and addressing the academic and behavioral needs of students through a tiered system. Let me explain where that comes from. A couple of issues there. One is, one of the things that I heard from members is that unless you have a school where a student feels safe and secure, then they're not going to be able to learn. So that's one of the goals of subsection F, is to increase, improve, and ensure the safety and security of the students. Also, because what we found in other states that have tried this is that having the appropriate ability to discipline students is an important component of having an ability to motivate students to do well academically. So that's what that language is intended to do. Lines 170 and 172, we have a new subsection G. It says opportunity schools shall develop and provide for integrated student supports that target academic and non-academic barriers to achievement, and where appropriate shall form partnerships to implement proven or innovative strategies. Again, based on the same impetus there as we had in the previous section. Line 178, we have added the word existing to describe all staff members at the qualifying school, and that is to clarify that we're not intending to cut anybody out of that process. Lines 189 to 191, we've added that local boards of education may use the authority contained in Code Section 20-2-943 to reassign staff, and in Code Section 20-2-948 to implement the reduction in force policy. And that's in response to questions and concerns from members about what would happen to existing staff at an opportunity school. Moving on to lines 214 and 215, we have inserted the words after soliciting and considering recommendations from the local legislative delegation. That was in response to the request from many members that there be more, a greater sense of legislative oversight in these processes. And there was a concern that someone may try to get a contract, a management contract, for the purpose of making a bunch of money off of these opportunity schools. While I think that is a pretty far-fledged idea, just based on what we've seen in other states, in order to shore up that concern, we have added this language so that members of the legislative delegation who have a school that's in OSD will be brought into the process for selecting the right management companies and right management agencies for those schools. All right. Moving on down, line 270. We have added the words that is substantially the same, and I believe that came from Representative Dudgeon. The concern has been, I'll give you an example. What's that? Yeah. The example that we've been given, again, from other states is that a school, Jones Elementary School, and if there is a Jones Elementary School, that's not connected to this comment, okay? Elementary School X, whatever name you gave it, if that school was on the list for being a qualifying school, as we use that term, the local board in some states would simply change the name of the school to Elementary School Y. They wouldn't change attendance zone, they wouldn't change grade span, they wouldn't change anything about the school itself, but they would claim then by having changed the name, oh, School Y is not on your list, so you can't do anything about that. So what we're trying to do, and for what it's worth, the recommendation from other states was, after we have created an opportunity school out of that building, that the local school board should not be allowed to use that building for any purpose for a period of 3 years. Of course, we thought that was too far. We didn't want to go that far with what we wanted to do. So what we have said is, if a local board of education wants to reopen a school in that same building, they can't use exactly the same school. You have to have some change, either in grade span or an attendance zone. And what Representative Dudgeon's amendment does is say that by adding the word substantially the same, he's making a little bit more of an argument to say changing one house in the school district is not enough, because that's still going to be substantially the same. You have to have some substantial difference. So that's a good amendment by, or good offer by Representative Dudgeon. Moving on, lines 317 to 318. For all opportunity schools, the entity responsible for data reporting shall comply with the requirements of Code Section 20-2-740. Turn it over to Aaron Hames to explain that one.
Yeah. This, we had a question about, would these schools have to report on the number of in-school suspensions, out-of-school suspensions, and expulsions? And they obviously do. That's in current law, but we just put this here to make clear that opportunity schools have to comply with that and have to report on the number of kids who have been expelled or suspended.
Thank you. And then moving on to lines 327, 328, we're clarifying that the funding shall include the local 5 mil share pursuant to OCGA section 20-2-164. And the next one, which is the last substantive change I have to offer you, is on lines 354 to 370. I'm not going to read this to you in detail, but I will tell you, I'll explain it to you briefly. And this is really what Chairman Dixon and I have been working on, along with Aaron and other members of the governor's office. And that is giving local boards of education the same flexibility that the OSD can use in operating a school that is a qualifying school. So it says to the local board of education, if you have a school that is what we'd call a qualifying school, I don't want to use the word failing, but qualifying school, in this legislation, you may apply to the State Board of Education and get waivers for all the same things that the OSD superintendent can get. And you've got a chance to do that, a chance basically to save your school before it comes to a point of intervention. That's really what that language does. Chairman Dixon, and I said we had been working right up until we walked in the room, and there is some additional language that I think will be offered in the form of an amendment by Chairman Dixon, and I would like to have Aaron just read that language for us, if I may. I think that's how it's all going to play out.
Okay, so on line 366, we're going to strike school on warning, school on probation, or. And then on line 368, at the end of that sentence, we're going to add a sentence that says, the State Board of Education shall communicate to the OSD superintendent any waivers granted to a school on warning or a school on probation. And so the effect of this is that for schools on warning or probation, the State Board of Education is simply communicating to the OSD what waivers they have granted for these schools. But then on qualifying schools, there's greater coordination. And the intent of this is that if there's greater coordination, the OSD will be better informed as to what things are already going on at the local district and where it would not be appropriate to intervene because they're already doing good things, innovative strategies that they're trying within the local district.
You're out of order.
So that's the those are the changes that we have in the bill. There are a couple of other things that a couple of other concerns that I've heard from members repeatedly that I think we've done a good job trying to communicate that some of the concerns raised, frankly, are not legitimate because they're not issues that are in the bill. And I'll tell you one in particular. There's been a concern that this bill would allow the state of Georgia to come in and acquire the property of a local school board, a local school, take it over, and then not give it back to the school or the school board at some other time. That's just patently false. The bill itself says that the OSD superintendent could elect to use that property that's owned by the school board, but it also provides a specific formula for how the OSD would then lease that property so that the local board of education does not lose its capital investment in that property. There are a couple of
ownership of that property.
Nor its ownership of that property. That's exactly right. Mr. Chairman, with that, I will set 4 questions.
All right. So we're beginning to have some questions here. The first question I have is Representative Glanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative, for listening and for implementing some of the changes that we've talked about over the course of the last couple of weeks. One of the things I'm really happy to see in on page 3 in regards to focusing on student growth. As I had conversations, actually had a conference call this morning with 3 superintendents that would remain unnamed. This was one of their biggest concerns about the bill. For instance, if a qualifying school has not reached the above the 60 level, but have shown consistency in growth over 3 years, is it not true that there would be schools that would be less likely to be picked up by the OSD?
That's true.
Okay, and again, once again, thank you, because that was a point of concern for not only myself but those who have voiced their concerns to me. So we appreciate that change.
And to that point, Mr. Glanton, not only is that true by what we put in this language, but as I've told the committee before, that's really the goal of this legislation. Is we don't want to take over, we don't want to intervene in a school just because it's qualifying if it's making progress in the right direction. We only want to intervene where there's not progress at the local school and there's no visible change at the local management level, so that an intervention would be justified.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Benton.
I didn't realize I'd get that quickly. Yeah.
You're not in your normal seat.
Well, I switched sides to kind of throw you off a little bit.
He's moved to the left.
Is it? I've got 2 questions right now, Mr. Chairman, and I'm
going to let you ask both questions. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. Is it possible for one set of students to affect up to 3 different schools and their careers?
I don't understand the question.
Well, you've got students that are not performing in an elementary school, and then they go to a middle school and they don't perform there, so they've left the elementary school, but it's still under the OSD. They go to the middle school that might not have been under the OSD, but now after 3 years of those students there, that school is now not a passing school. They go on to the high school and affect it there as well. Is it possible that could happen?
I think I understand your question, and I think that's a valid point, and that's why in line 65, one of the things that the OSD has to consider is feeder patterns within multiple eligible schools. So if you have, say, a high school, middle school, and maybe a high school with 2 feeder elementaries and 2 feeder middles and 5 feeder elementaries, and you can see a pattern where 3 of those elementaries and 1 of those middle schools are all in this qualifying description, then the OSD superintendent will look for those patterns that will have the greatest impact on the rest of the schools in the district. So you would certainly be looking at those feeder schools on the lower grade levels, trying to affect a positive change going forward into the higher schools that are also qualifying.
Okay, thank you. On page 7, line 199, says the commission shall set such goals and hold such teachers and school leaders accountable, but I don't see anything in there about parents or students.
Right, because parents and students are not employees of the state of Georgia. They are the people we serve.
They are the customer, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, and if you don't have parent involvement, then the students are not going to be involved, correct?
That's right, and we do have. And I would also point out that one of the things we heard throughout this process from the people who've been through this experience in other places is community involvement is a key critical component to success. And where you don't have the right kind of community involvement, you're not going to have any real meaningful success. So we've built in community involvement, community feedback. We've made requirements for OSD to get that community feedback at multiple steps in the process, because we really do want to have community buy-in. Because what I keep telling the committee, and what I'm going to tell the House when we bring this to a vote, is we're trying to push local control down to the school level. It is an intervention by a state agency, but the intervention's goal is to push the control down to the local school. So we're not. So it would make no sense for us to say we're going to do that and then not hold those local school officials accountable for the results that they produce.
Okay, but I'll go back to the question I asked you on last Wednesday. Was that if you change the teachers and you change the administration, the only thing that you've got left are the same students and the same parents. So,
right, and I will give you the same response I've given others, and that is, it is not I use the same word. It's not pie in the sky, because we've seen it happen. We've seen the effects of changing the expectations, changing the atmosphere, and doing that by changing leadership and letting leadership have the freedom to do what it needs to do in order to change the atmosphere of the school, and then by that changing the expectations in the school, and frankly changing the expectation in the community. So yeah, it's real simplistic to just say we're changing a principal and some teachers, but that misses the broader imperative, which is we're not just changing teachers and principals. We're actually putting people in place who have a desire and an ability to bring in community actors, bring in the rest of the community involvement to support this project, and see that education really can change and can change the community in the process.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Next we have Representative Dudgeon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just very briefly, I just wanted to thank Representative Coomer and the Governor's Office for working lots of changes. It's important legislation. I appreciate that. A lot of people come to me with sort of what I would call technical, well, what if the local board did this, and what if the state did that, and stuff like that. To me, is it not true that the goal of this is really to work on student achievement in that building and not to create power struggles and things like that? And the superintendent of the OSD is going to want and actually be motivated to work as closely as he can with people that are to upset as few apple carts as possible and not looking into getting into turf wars, because it's really all about student achievement. And though you can pick this apart for small little what I would call windows, or what if this happened and then the board would have this and they have the school, and what about the facility? That's not the goal of this. The goal of this is really to create an environment to get that student achievement up with the facilities and with the people that we can make use of. And is it not true that there's not going to be any goal it's not a takeover? I think that word kind of bothers me, and the fact that people think that the goal is to come in and apply power, and I want to run this school, and that's probably an improper word. The word is we want to improve the student achievement, and you're going to want to work with as many people there locally as possible. I guess all that stuff, is that not true?
That is absolutely true. And let me
Good question.
Let me add to that I have had many conversations, not just with members of the committee and members of this legislative body, but also with other interested parties. I had a phone call this morning with a former state superintendent about this issue, and what I can tell you has been common in those discussions is when I listen to each of the objections, which many of you've heard, and I give each logical response, which is, it's not in the bill like that, this is what it provides, and we come down to the very last part of the conversation, I say, and I said it today, so what you're really saying is you don't have any problem with the creation of this new entity. You don't have any problem with what it's going to cost. You don't have any problem with the achievement we're trying to reach. Your real problem is you want to be in control instead of somebody else being in control. And the answer I got, to my great surprise this morning, was Yeah, that's it. Really, that's it. So if it's just a turf war, just call it what it is and do what you want. But really, it's about making sure that these children in these districts that are not getting what they need and deserve have another tool in the kit to get what they need and deserve in education.
Well, thank you all. I've handled this very well. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next, we have next question is from Representative Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also wanted to say thank you to Representative Coomer. We spent a long time talking, and I know that I shared a number of concerns with the governor's office. And I did have an opportunity to talk to a couple of school board members over the weekend. But in the last meeting, one of my questions was about for-profits. And I know that you've made some provisions where OSD schools' relationship with private contractors and the oversight you've added. But do those provisions prohibit for-profit charter schools? And I'm only asking that because it's not that I so much object to that. It's that I know we heard from New Orleans or Tennessee that their for-profits just left, and so Tennessee put a provision in that only allowed for nonprofits. So,
yeah, again, the language in the bill provides that an opportunity school would be a public school, a non-sectarian, non-religious, nonprofit, not a homeschool education setting. So we have that in the makeup of the school itself. I understand that some people are concerned that there may be a contract with a for-profit entity, but that's what schools do now. Public schools and charter schools in the state of Georgia contract with vendors who are for-profit vendors, whether it be an air conditioning manufacturer who happens to do a contract with a local school, or if it's a janitorial service, or if it's psychology and counseling services. And even management companies come in and help. They contract sometimes for these schools. But I think the real saving grace in this whole prospect, this whole bill, is the continued emphasis on community involvement, and even now the requirement that before a school can contract for those services, they're going to have oversight with their legislative delegation. So we do have a lot of safeguards in there. I think to say that a school could never contract with a for-profit entity would be a tying of the hands that would have unnecessary negative consequences.
And I would just add to that, NACSA, which is largely considered the gold standard when it comes to charter school authorizing, it's the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, doesn't recommend that you prohibit working with for-profit vendors, companies, management companies. What they recommend is that you have strong oversight over those companies, and our state charter commission follows all of their recommendations and has that oversight over those companies. And so, those mechanisms are in place and are already being used in the state.
Okay. Next, we have number 4. That's Representative Howard.
I was about to wave, but I'll take you up on that. The community buy-in piece. And first, let me say thank you too, as everyone, for taking a bold stand. And we all know that there are some problems in education in the state of Georgia. I don't think whether you're for or against this bill, I think we all would agree with that. And the question becomes, how do you fix it? And we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to get out of it overnight in short term. But you have to make strides and to fix it. The community piece and the community buy-in piece. Would it not be a better buy-in if we had the opportunity to go back and vet this with our constituents? We took this bill up. This bill came out, as far as I know, after we were in session, and we've been working constantly every week. You get the weekends, and I know people expect us to lead, and I come from a political background, listen then act, and not act, then listen, because that can be dangerous at times. And in order for the community, I think the community even would like to engage. Is it not true, or would it not be better if we had that opportunity to allow the community, allow those parents?
Let's get to going to give them a question.
Allow those parents and students to give us some feedback, because a lot of times, and as well as teachers.
Give them a question, Mr. Howard. We got to.
I'm getting there.
All right.
I'll move a little slow,
I know it,
Chairman, but I'll get there.
I know you do. I love you.
Right. I love you too. But is there a community buy-in that we can find a better way to approach it?
Let me answer that, and there are three parts of my answer. One is, first of all, I guess fourth, the overarching answer is yes, we want community buy-in. We want community support for this opportunity school district to work. That support comes in, first of all, if the bill passes, the support is mandated, or not, the support's not mandated, the reach out to the community is mandated on the OSD superintendent through this bill. Repeatedly. It's all through the bill. You can't hardly turn a page without finding something about community support and community involvement. Secondly, it comes in the form of an election at the ballot by all the voters of this state who are going to have to vote on this constitutional amendment. So there really can be no more direct form of community support, engaging community support for this, than putting it to the community for a vote. And then the third thing I would say is that one of the things that Senator Duplessis, who had carried this legislation in Louisiana in 2003, one of the things that she said was, if you go and ask the parents in Louisiana now, if they had a good experience or a bad experience with charters, if their school succeeded or failed after the changes were implemented, she said you can't find anybody who would say, maybe you can find somebody, but she kind of indicated you can't find anybody who says, let's go back to the old system. Let's go back to the old way of doing it because we want to go back to that. It was better for us. It was better for our children, better for our community. So looking at the examples we've seen, the communities where it's worked, it's worked well. And then we are going to give our communities an opportunity to buy in through the through the constitutional amendment process, and the legislation mandates that.
So, one follow-up.
One more question, yeah.
So, in the constitutional amendment, in the language that's being brought forward, you know, it's the language to me leans more in a direction that most people will say yes, because it's the question that you're asking. I think all of us want that answer. But would you be amenable to any adjustments or language changes in the?
Well, the reason that the constitutional amendment question is broad, and in fact the amendment itself is broad, is because the place we come from in bringing this forward is the Supreme Court has said, state, you don't have any interest in this, you don't have any authority for this. So we are trying to put an amendment on the ballot that does give as broad of authority as possible while still being narrow enough to be a legally passable constitutional amendment.
Okay. The next is number 15. That's, where's that? Okay. Setzler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the author, isn't it true that our current Georgia Constitution provides an obligation to the state to provide a free and adequate public education?
Yes. That's the primary obligation.
Help me understand, if we weren't to pass this measure, and we were given the opportunity to, if we truly believe that providing another form of governance was best for kids, and the current state of the Constitution was as is proposed in your proposition. If the proposition passes and it's 10 years down the road, has anyone
I know there's a question there somewhere.
There is. I'm trying to follow, Mr. Chairman.
I know. I'm sorry.
I'm going to.
You want me to come back to you?
I'm just going to wrap up by saying to committee members, it is a primary responsibility of the state to provide a free and adequate education to our students. And if we as a General Assembly or we as a state believe there was a school or two schools that the only way they could be reformed was to have a new governance model, we as a state, isn't it true under their current constitutional structure, there's nothing we could do about it. It would be the sole province and responsibility of that school board, and we as a state could not act without this constitutional amendment. Isn't that true?
That's correct, and that's why I encourage members, even if you would like to see additional changes to the legislation, we can continue having that discussion. But I would encourage every member to really think about the importance of giving your constituents, the people who put you in office, the opportunity to cast a vote on this ballot resolution.
Let me say this. There are 14 lights up here now, so I'm going to ask you to stick to your questions, answer as quickly as you can, and let's be right to the point. And so, because I want everybody to have a chance. Number 26, that's Representative Nix, all right?
Thank you. I will be quick.
No, that's okay, but I want everybody to have a chance. But yeah, okay.
I appreciate the legislation. I love the insertion of PBIS into this. The positive behavioral intervention and supports, and the RTI, that response to intervention. That answers some of the questions. This, if it's used to fidelity, goes into the community. This involves the entire community when you do this. And that I might make known, if the school is qualifying now, they have available to them through the State Board of Education the PBIS programs. So I think the fact that this is in here shows the importance of them. And if there's schools out there that are qualifying that want to make changes prior to that, they need to call and get part of this. I've been part of the PBIS system, some of the things that we've done, and that is a great piece to have in there, not only for this, but for any other school. And I'll just make that as a statement. There's no question. Thank you.
Isn't that not true?
Isn't that not true?
Okay. Next, number 20.
I'll just add to that really briefly that there also is a piece of legislation that I think the full committee is going to consider, that subcommittee considered on Friday, that this language tracks exactly the language in Senator Emanuel Jones' bill that has come over to the House. It tracks that exact language.
That's true. That is correct. Okay. Now, next I have Representative Tom Dixon.
And I'll tell you up front, Mr. Chairman, there's not a question. One of the things that we talked about the other day was the possibility of a 5 or a 10-year review of this bill. And obviously that didn't make it into this. But I would say that, as you well know, over a period of years, once we pass a piece of legislation, it constantly is going to be reevaluated in the legislature. We're going to have 2 or 3 years before this actually starts to implement. We'll have more information at that point from other states that are using this, and you are aware that there will probably be attempts to come back and refine it a little more as we get into that process. And I think that's part of the legislative intent. And I would thank you for the time that we have shared. It's good to know that we can do some of these things and have some give and take.
The only thing I'd add to that is other states that have passed these measures have come back and amended them and refined them and improved them over time. We certainly don't expect this to be any different and see that as part of the legislative process.
Very good. All right. Next we have on the number 3, Representative Dickinson, rather. Pam Dickinson, Representative.
My sister.
Yeah, you again. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Coomer. I just wanted to ask a question that was asked of me by people in my district. Will the local school boards, you talk about them having to manage or have to pay for all of the expenses of the major expenses of the Opportunity School District, would that create any unintentional consequences for those school boards?
No, and Aaron will help me locate the exact language, but basically the bill requires that the ordinary use and repairs will be covered by what I would think of as the tenant, the person leasing the building. But just like in any other commercial lease situation, the landlord, the owner of the building, is going to have to do the major repairs because it's their investment, it's their property. They get it back at the end of the lease.
That's exactly right. It's line 276.
Line 276.
Okay.
Did I get your question?
Kind of, sort of, because it talks about extensive repairs, and that was just, a concern
Yes, ma'am.
for some people. That,
You have another one?
no, nothing.
And line 271 is the part that talks about routine repairs by the OSD superintendent.
Is that it? Get it? Okay, Representative, I'd see 10, and that's Representative Belton.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the time Mr. Coomer has also spent with me talking about these issues. I really applaud the governor for doing this. I really believe he wants to do what's best for the child, and I agree with that. I wonder about the scale of it. And whether we like this governor, we might not like the next governor, but what he or she will do with this kind of power. Why not lay those fears a scale by reducing it from 100 down to 50 or 75? 100 schools is almost 5% of the schools in Georgia.
Representative Belton, as we've talked before, and as I have addressed publicly before, the reason for having an appropriate number of schools that could be coming into this district is so that we have a way to incentivize as many people as possible to take as much action as possible to fix their problems without ever coming into the school district. If we only have one school a year or two schools a year, then we're not going to have the proper opportunity for incentive to those schools or to those school boards around the state who really aren't going to be doing this on their own without an appropriate incentive to do that. That's my concern.
Okay. Number 25. That's okay. All right, there you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about this new provision on page 11 talking about the waivers that the Department of Education can grant to qualifying schools as well as schools on waiver or schools on probation. Is it possible, or would you consider a provision allowing the Department of Education to grant those types of waivers now? Because this is going to take a few years before this can happen, because a school would have to be a qualifying school not selected as an opportunity school, meaning that is a few years out in the future. And I think some superintendents would like this discretion or release from rules and regulations currently.
Well, and I'll let Aaron follow me here, but currently, schools do have opportunities for getting these kinds of waivers, and really the reason this bill has become an item of interest is because there are districts that simply are not accessing any of those tools available to them now to improve schools that are not performing at an acceptable standard. So while we're incorporating this language into the OSD bill, because we want it to be available as an alternative then when a school is on this list, I believe those kinds of flexibilities, maybe those exact same flexibilities, are available in the form of waivers if a system elects to take one of the other tools that are already available.
All right. So the under current law, systems can receive that flexibility system-wide under either IE squared or the charter system model. They can receive it for individual schools, but not for the big four waivers, so class size, expenditure controls, certification, and somebody help me, I can't remember the fourth one, but the four big ones. And so what this allows for these schools is that you can grant all the waivers, including the big four. The state board could grant those for individual schools and districts. This legislation only becomes law if the constitutional amendment passes. So in order to do that for schools prior to that, we would have to pass it in a different piece of legislation.
But if the constitutional amendment passes, then it's going to be a couple of years before any school enters the Opportunity School District.
Yes.
So
the 17,
in that period
18,
of time between the approval of the constitutional amendment for schools to be able to get the waivers from the big four requirements, it seems that schools would want the flexibility to do that immediately.
The problem with that is without the constitutional amendment, we don't have the authority to do that.
But, I mean, once the constitutional amendment is approved, assuming it would be, is there a way to immediately allow schools to opt into those big four waivers?
Yeah, once it's passed, yes.
And you could do it short of that.
They already, schools right now, ladies and gentlemen, that's the big argument we had, and Representative Carter and I talked about this, you remember Friday. Schools right now, You got to realize, for the last few years, schools have had complete flexibility, ladies and gentlemen, because we've just waived everything because of the economy. But right now, they must choose IE Square, charter system. If a school chooses IE Square today, they have them. They can pick the flexibility they want, whether this bill passes or not. And Representative Carter was talking, should we delay that? We don't have to do a thing. It's going to happen. So they've got that already. So schools could jump onto that bandwagon right now and start doing that now.
Can I answer the question? I think I can clarify.
All right, go ahead.
Because that section will apply to a school that has only been had 1 year where they have not met the requirements, they would almost immediately be available because the requirements are already in place. I mean, it's the schools could consider would know whether they're on the warning or the probation status right now, even though the warning and the probation doesn't exist at this point. So as soon as the amended chart, the constitutional amendment passes, I think the state board would automatically be available to do this for any school, any system that has a school that has 1, 2, or 3 years of that.
All right, we have 2 more questions here. 24.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about when the schools, if you're a parent and you have a school that, I understand we've changed the language now to be qualifying, but if we don't change the language in the resolution to mimic it, then we're still calling the schools failing. So what opportunity does a parent have to leave that school, and will the OSC provide transportation like they do in Tennessee? I mean, if my school that my children are in is called failing, whether it's in the resolution or the bill, I'm going to want out of there. I'm not going to want to wait 3 years for a turnaround.
I missed the first part of your question. I was still angry about something somebody else asked me, and I was distracted. So go ahead.
I was there earlier today. So my concern is that we're not mimicking the language in the resolution with what we've made changed in the bill, right? So regardless of whether it's in the bill or the resolution, the school in the resolution is called failing.
Yeah.
What opportunity does a parent have to leave that school? And like in Tennessee, they provide transportation for those parents. What are we doing in Georgia? Are we?
I was going to say, I know on Friday you said I had to answer your questions. Would it be okay if I let Aaron answer that one?
It's fine for Aaron to answer.
Current law allows students to transfer within their district to another school. The practical reality of that is they don't always have the ability to transfer because there's not always space available at a higher performing school within the district. And then your question about transportation is, yes, the opportunity schools would provide transportation. Many of them would likely contract back with their local district to provide those transportation services, but the opportunity district would have to pay the local school board for the services.
Is that, will you tell me where in the bill that is?
I will.
I just didn't. And then while you're looking, Mr. Chairman, I don't know, are we taking the resolution up separately?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we're dealing right now with enabling, just enabling right now. 133 is all we're dealing with right now.
I looked, I just cannot find it.
And we'll take question on the other one in just a minute. Why don't we, while we let Aaron look at that, why don't we take Valencia's question? We'll let Valencia. All right, number 14. Let's take your question.
Okay,
we'll let you
Mr.
address
Chairman,
the chairman.
thank you.
You find it, Aaron? Did you find it?
Yes,
okay.
sir, I did.
Excuse me. Okay.
Okay. Line 158. So it starts above there. It requires a local board to cooperate fully with the Opportunity School and to make available at a reasonable cost all appropriate services requested. Such services may include, but are not limited to, transportation, cafeteria services, custodial services.
Mr. Chairman, can I just follow up for clarity?
Yes.
So I guess, again, my question is the same conversation I had with the superintendent in Tennessee, that it's one thing to be in a school that you're not really happy with, and we do have choices, but if the school is considered failing and you want out, which I would, this doesn't state that we are providing transportation as they do in Tennessee. It says it may include.
So I understand. I thought your question was, did they have to provide transportation for the kids in their attendance zone to come to that school? I misunderstood your question regarding transportation. This does not provide for providing transportation for a child that is zoned to attend a school to attend a different school. And I don't think there's ever been a provision in state law that provided transportation for that.
No. Most state law says you have to provide your own transportation. Even in school, it's a choice, right?
That's right.
Any other questions, Representative Conson?
No, thank you.
All right, I'm sorry, Representative Stovall, you've been so patient. Your time.
All right, thank you, Representative Coomer and Aaron and Mr. Chairman. I actually have two questions.
Yes, ma'am, you may have to.
The first one is, will this OSD legislation allow for a centralized focus on those lowest performing schools, which is what the local school system can't do now, because they have to focus on the high, the middle, low, lowest, and alternative schools? That's the first question.
Right. So the answer, of course, is yes, that this would allow for a specific focus on the schools that are having the greatest struggles in performance.
All right. Next question is, when the flexibility models that we talked about earlier, the IE squared and the charter system are implemented, wouldn't the school systems have at least 3 years to move those schools off of the list using the waivers that are be granted under those two provisions?
Yes, that's correct.
Good questions. Good question. This time I'd like to recognize our speaker. Wave, okay. All right, we've taken all the 27. Is that no one? Okay.
I didn't do
Wait,
that. No, I don't talk.
Don't you don't? Okay.
I didn't punch the button.
Okay. All right. At this time, we're going to get ready to take some motions, and we have a proposed amendment out there. So I want everyone to listen very carefully. One thing I think we need to realize is, I heard some waving, and I saw some waving in the crowd when we talked about I Square and charter systems and a couple of things a few minutes ago. But let me say this: we do not have in Georgia at this time a way to take over schools. The courts have not ruled in our favor. Is that not true?
That's correct.
All right. That being the truth, the fact, we have given schools the last 5 or 6 years all the flexibility they've wanted, maybe not all the money they've necessarily wanted, but they've had the opportunity to do this. Under this, they have to choose I Square, charter, or we're not going to call it status quo, let's call it traditional schools to get this flexibility. And I hope, and I really believe that most of the schools, because I've had several superintendents say to me, you won't take my schools over, I will straighten them out. And they're doing it. And I applaud those. But those that won't, and I'm going to tell you, for 51 years I've been in this, and I've seen some that just won't. And this committee here, we traveled this state over 2,000 miles. We visited a lot of schools, and we saw some that just won't change. But this gives us the chance, for the first time in the history of this state, to take those and try to help those children get them out of that. Is that not correct?
That's correct.
And I think that's what it's all about, ladies and gentlemen. We've given the opportunity. They haven't. And I honestly believe 75 to 80% of these will do it. But those that don't, let's help those children get out. That's what it's all about. Now, I am going to take a motion on this bill, and then we'll go with the amendment. Do I have a motion? Number 20.
Mr. Chairman, I move do pass Senate Bill 133 LC 336176 ECS.
I have a motion. Do I have a second? I have a second from, would you second it, Van there? Yes. I have a second. All right. Now, I have a motion and a second. Now, we do have an amendment. So at this time, I'd like to ask Aaron, if you could, I think, Tom, you have it. All right, Representative Dixon, if you would give us the amendment at this time.
The amendment is as follows. On line 366, we will strike, beginning with the word school, school on warning, comma, school on probation, comma, or. Strike that language. All right. And then on line 368, we will add the sentence, the State Board of Education shall communicate to the OSD superintendent any waivers granted to a school on warning or a school on probation.
You heard the proposed amendment. Do I have any questions? If not, I have a motion for that amendment. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right. Do I have any objection? Any objection to the amendment? If not, the amendment passes. All right. So now we have before us LC 336176-ECS, Senate Bill 133 as amended. We have a motion to pass and a second. Now I'm going to ask you to do this. Any questions? None? All in favor, I'm going to ask you to please, and Sheena, y'all be ready. Help me out, Courtney. Please raise your hand if you vote yes on the bill. Raise your hand. Keep them up high. Now remember, only those that are on the committee can vote. There's some in here that you think are not voting, but they're not members of the committee. So, how many do you have?
13.
What do you have, Sheena? Come on, now we.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have several ex officio members. They can vote. Well, let's count them. Keep your hands up.
Yeah.
13. 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Tom, you can't see his hand.
You're eclipsing him.
What do you not count?
Come on, Tom.
Who? Yes, he's a member. They're ex officio. We got everybody who's voting is a member. All right, 13. All right, now those against, please raise your hand if you're against the bill.
That's 6.
What do you have? No. We have, count them again. 6. All right, 13 to 6, the bill does pass. All right. All right, now let's take up the next, all right, this time we will take up Senate Resolution 287. All right, Representative.
Mr. Chairman, are you ready for me?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Chairman, there were no changes to the amendment, to the resolution, Senate Resolution 287, from when we presented it previously, and I'd ask for the committee's favorable vote.
Aren't you ready?
Yes, sir.
Any questions? All right, you ready for questions?
Yes, sir.
All right, I have a question 24. Representative Kaiser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess it's the same question I've been asking over and over. Would you be open to an amendment to change the language to mimic the bill's changes from failing to qualifying?
The difference between the bill and the resolution is that the resolution, again, is designed to give us the broadest flexibility in implementing an appropriate set of legislation. And sometimes when we're doing an amendment, especially on the ballot question, we don't necessarily use technical language because we want it to be digestible by the person reading the question. So while we do have the word failing schools, chronically failing public schools, that does convey essentially what we're trying to get to in the legislation, even though we use a different nomenclature using the word failing at that point. I would be opposed to changing the resolution, and frankly, I don't tell anybody else this, but I don't really trust the Senate to get it right again. So I'd rather us handle it here and move forward.
Mr. Chairman, can I just quickly follow up? I'm
ahead,
just wondering, because I wasn't part of this discussion, was there any other word? I mean, it just goes back to what I've said all along with the IE square, status quo, and we've gotten that changed because it left a lot of heartburn with people. So I guess I'm just wondering, was another word discussed than failing?
Yes.
And I'm talking as a parent.
We considered lots of other words, and to Representative Coomer's point, in order to make the amendment question digestible, if you just put the word qualifying in there, what qualifies them? I mean, that could open up to we're intervening in all kinds of local school systems. We talked about academic priority schools. That's a term that has a specific meaning under federal law. We talked about schools not making adequate yearly progress. Again, that has a term, that has a specific meaning under federal law. So we did talk about a lot of different terms. They have been battered around and talked about with legislators. But I think this is the clearest indication of what it is that this would allow the state to do, and that is to intervene only in chronically failing schools. And so it makes the amendment more narrow, and I think it's clear to the people of Georgia what it is that they're voting to allow to do or voting to not allow.
Does that answer your questions, Representative Kaiser?
Yes, sir.
All right. Next we have Speaker Pro Tem Jones.
Isn't it true that in a constitutional amendment, as you mentioned, it is important to use language that your average person could understand, and that I find after 13 years on this committee that we use a lot of acronyms and phrases, including, qualifying schools that receive ratings. Most voters do not have a child in the public schools, so they're even less likely to know what some of those phrases and acronyms mean. But I do think chronically failing, it's not a very pretty phrase, but I think your average person, if their child's in one of these schools or if they have one in their community, they have a pretty good idea of what that means. And certainly in the bill, the fact that it's been 3 consecutive years at the lowest rating, I don't think anyone in that community will be that surprised. But I do think it is, isn't it true, that I think it's important that we use, that we not pretty it up so much that it's not clear to the voters that we're talking about schools that are in desperate need of intervention.
Right, and being sensitive to the concerns about labels and negative connotations associated with labels that we heard about in committee hearing and elsewhere. We want to make sure that the language in the bill that designates these schools doesn't have an adverse effect unintentionally. However, in the constitutional amendment, this term chronically failing schools is never going to be applied or isn't applied through the statute we're presenting as a specific describing term for any school. So our effort, again, when the rubber meets the road, we don't want to turn kids and families off to having an opportunity for education. When we're asking the voters to support what we're doing, we want to tell them what we're doing. We're intervening in chronically failing schools.
Okay, number 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't going to ask a question. I was wanting to be recognized for an amendment when the time comes.
At the time, well, now's not the time. We'll hold up, I'll call you, come back to you. All right, number 3.
I passed, Mr. Chairman. My question was answered.
Ma'am?
I passed.
Okay, you pass. All right. Next, then we have number 19.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a point of clarity, is it not true that if we were to change the wording from chronically failing schools to qualifying schools, we would then have to include the definition of qualifying schools, which at that point would put a referendum, a question on the ballot that would probably be 2 pages long. Is that not true?
That's a possibility, yeah.
Okay. Then number 24, and then number 4. 24. Oh, I'm sorry.
On line 3, my question is mimicking here on the ballot question in chronically failing public schools, while we're not saying state intervention for chronically failing schools there, it just further qualifies that it's a 3-year, a school that's been in failure for 3 years.
I'm sorry, on line 3 of the resolution? I see line 3 of the resolution says intervention for failing schools.
Right. I guess my question is why we're not calling them there chronically failing. And again, I have 6 schools in my district that are on this list, and so,
If I may, that's just the introductory language to the resolution. It's not the actual substantive.
Oh, so that
portion.
won't be on the.
Right.
Okay, so no one's going to see that. Okay, my error.
Okay. Number 4.
As we discuss these words, did we ever think about using the word struggling versus failing? Because failing is just such a negative.
The concern is that there are lots of schools that struggle, but their performance is, an average performance, and it wouldn't be appropriate for the state to intervene in those schools. This bill only preserves local control and only allows a check on that authority when a school is chronically failing. And so the language of chronically failing is really important for narrowing what it is that we're allowing the state to do, which is to only intervene in a very limited circumstance, which is when a school is chronically failing. So I think struggling just is way too loosey-goosey in the sense of we could qualify every school, we could classify every school in the state as a struggling school. Educating kids is really hard. That's always a struggle, and so that's the concern with the term.
And I would add to that loosey-goosey is an education term, not necessarily a legal term, although Ms. Hames is both an educator and a lawyer. And I would also, I mean, just by way of example, I was always a struggling student. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I was a failing student, but I was not always a failing student, but I was always struggling. So I get, that's the problem with all these terms, is we can attach certain meanings to them that may or may not be appropriate in the context of the ballot question. But it's pretty clear what a we have a pretty clear understanding of what a failing school is.
Yeah, and my response to that is, as you use the word failing and brand a kid, thousands of kids with that word, it's sort of like saying you're branding someone with something that's negative. And I'm not the word expert. There's a lot more people in here that can come up with words a lot better than I can. But failing is not the only way to describe what.
Right, and that's why we
dealing
changed.
with.
I'm sorry. That's why we changed it in the legislation, so we could get away from that kind of a negative connotation on the label when we do implement the actual legislation.
Okay. I have two more speakers. Number 15. That is all right, Representative Setzer.
Representative Coomer, I'd like to thank you for the clarity. This is clear. It's plain spoken. My constituents tell me all the time that government is guilty of double speak and trying to obfuscate what it is. I think the ballot question is very clear. I think the constitutional amendment is exactly what we would want to put on the Constitution. I think there's simply a policy question that's before us. And, Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time, I'd like to be recognized and make a motion.
All right. Number 23, Representative Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want, a failing school is below a 60, correct? And I don't love the word, but a student who has a 69 receives an F on his or her report card. So if it's a 60 or below or a 59 or below, then it is failing school. So, I get what you're saying. I'm mostly saying this to you, but if a student fails a class, the student failed the class. And so, I'm a teacher and I teach in a school, but, and I hate to hear anything's failing, but that is what it is in the way that it's written. So, that's really all I had to say, but. No, there's no question. Is that not true?
Is that not true? I
Yes.
like that. Good question. All right. All right. Number 24, Representative Kaiser.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I am reading this.
I want you to be satisfied.
Okay, I'm reading this over. So the line I'm referencing, I said 3. And the question is about line 13, which is actually on the ballot. So where's the
ballot question is line 22
to 24.
At the bottom.
Ballot question will be lines 22 to 24. The constitutional amendment is at lines 9 through 17. So it does say in the constitutional amendment, we use the word failing.
Right, that's where I'm asking if the language couldn't be chronically failing as well.
It is.
It's,
on line 13?
Right. The ballot question has chronically failing, and the amendment itself just says that the OSD would be approved, creation would be approved, and authorize the state to assume supervision of schools which have been determined to be failing through any governance model allowed by law. And so we're creating there is a governance model there's already the CCRPI, which is a measuring stick, but the governance model is what we would be creating through the OSD legislation.
But isn't that, which have been determined to be failing, weren't we determining them to be chronically failing? Because there it just suggests, is that not correct?
Well, I think what you're I think what you can read into the to line 13 is 12 and 13 is that schools which have been determined to be failing indicates that it's not an immediate moment of failure. It is a process of failure, which goes along with the concept of chronically failing.
Right. So I guess that's my question: why we're not saying determined to be chronically failing through any governance model.
I think you're splitting hairs when you get into that discussion.
Show me that once again. All right. Any other? We have one more question. Is that? And then you can think. If you have another, Margaret, I'll come back. Representative Kaiser, Speaker Pro Tem Jones.
Yes, sir. I would just like to. Isn't it true? Make a question in the form, a comment in the form of a question. Is it true that there are no euphemisms? I think this is more to what Representative Carter was saying, who's a very dedicated teacher. There are no euphemisms for students who fail to graduate. It's called a very poor future. There are no euphemisms for students who are 1 or 2 grade levels behind. It means they have a very poor future. We know statistically the odds of those students graduating or getting a job are very curtailed. It puzzles me that would be so that we would be so reluctant to try to put a euphemism over the situation for these children who have these types of futures in the constitutional amendment. People know intuitively what it means to fail, and because they have in these areas, they have friends, they have neighbors, they have classmates and family members that have failed to graduate. These schools have, the high schools have very low graduation rates. We as a state have a low graduation rate. That is what I'm more concerned about than a euphemism in putting it in a constitutional amendment, and I think that's where our focus should be. Isn't that not true?
I think that's true, Madam Speaker, and I think what you're saying, and I got in trouble trying to say what I think Representative Dixon was saying last week, so I'll put it this way. What I hear is that it's okay to tell a student they're failing. It's not okay to tell adults they're failing. That's what I hear.
And the students do not have the option. I mean, they are given a geographic district and geographic zone, and we have compulsory education laws. They don't have another option. We're just trying to give them another option.
Is it okay? Okay. We have right now 3 more questions, and I'm going to take motion. I have someone who's asked for a motion. Representative Kaiser, you have a question?
I just want to further state, I have several schools in my district that are on this list, and with the CCRPI index, they move up, right, each year. So I guess it's important to me from the people I'm hearing from that it's defined to be chronically failing, because that's a 3-year failure. It's not labeled. So I apologize if it seems to be a euphemism. It's an important issue that's been brought to me by my constituents.
And I don't think that your question about the accuracy of the amendment and the ballot question is euphemistic, and I don't think, and when I said splitting hairs, I mean that like literally kind of in a legal sense, that I think that the distinction between what it means to have been determined to be a failing, to schools which have been determined to be failing, which indicates this process, this period of action. The distinction between that and chronically failing, I think the distinction between those two concepts is it may be I'm not even sure what word to use for it. I don't think there is a significant legal difference between those two phrases. And when we talk about chronically failing, we do define that concept as a qualifying school in the bill. I mean, we talk about what a qualifying school is, and that's where we get to engendering what a chronically failing school is in the accompanying legislation. And that's why we brought the legislation forward to go with the amendment, because we want everybody here who's working on it to see what we're talking about while we're talking about it.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation. But given the schools that have contacted me that are on the failing list, I mean, I feel like it's important to demonstrate that they're chronically failing, but at least the house isn't burning down, right, to this meeting.
That's a fair point.
All right, let's keep your, all right, number 22, Representative. I have 2 more questions. That's what I'm taking, all right?
I would just say I do think it is a problem when we state it one way in the amendment and one way in the ballot question. Chronically is a modifying word. If I go to get a bank loan and I have to admit that I was late making a payment, that's very different from having to say to them, I'm chronically late making payments. It is a substantive difference.
But if you,
I'm not sure if you're going to get to correct it or not, but I'm just saying I think that was a mistake in crafting that language.
If I take your example and I say a borrower which has been determined to be failing to make his payments, I'm not sure how that is in a technical sense different than a borrower who is chronically failing to make his payments. I just don't think there's a legal distinction there that would create a legal problem for the amendment and the ballot question.
I guess we can agree to differ.
Sure, yeah.
All right, last question, number 25.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just following up on what Representative Kaiser and Chairman Dixon said. I, too, agree that I just feel like the language should be parallel. If we're going out to ask voters shall the Constitution be amended to allow the state to intervene in chronically failing public schools, if they vote yes to that, then I think that the language in the constitutional amendment should reference those chronically failing public schools.
Well, I appreciate the comment, and I would just reiterate, or maybe I should ask you to give me or a cite to authority that makes you come to the conclusion that the language, schools which have been determined to be failing, is legally different from chronically failing.
Well, would it be possible to then go the other way and change the wording of the ballot question to be, does the power have the state to intervene in failing schools? I wouldn't think so, but I'm just saying, to me, it seems like the language should be the same.
As the sponsor of the legislation, right, I would be opposed to that change.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Now, we've taken all the questions. I have a motion from 15 that is... there you go. All right. 15.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to pass on Senate Resolution 287.
All right. Now, stay here because we've got several things going on. Everyone, please listen very carefully what's going on. We have a motion, Senate Resolution 287 do pass. Representative Setzler, I have a second. All right. Now, I have an amendment that was offered by Representative Benton. All right, Representative Benton, you're recognized at this time for your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Everyone listen very carefully.
On line 13, and the sentence, if you go back up there, it says operation of public elementary and secondary schools which have been determined, and there at the determined is where I want to insert my amendment, and I'm doing this because of something that Representative Coomer said, that we're looking to make this a local thing, that I would like to insert after determined by both the state and the local district to be failing through any governance model allowed by law.
Did all of you hear this? Now listen. He's saying after the word determined, have been determined, to insert to be determined by both the state and local system to be failing.
Local district.
Local district. All right, local district. All right, by both the state and local district.
That's it.
Oh, you got that? All right, we got that motion. Everybody understand it? Do I have a second? Do I have a second? Raise your hand. I can't hear you. Have a second? I have a second. All right, you hear the amendment. I have a motion and a second that we do this. All right. Sheena, all of my staff, please be ready. Anyone, all in favor of the amendment as read by Representative Benton, please indicate by raising your hand. If you're for the amendment.
Oh, I'm sorry, for the amendment.
If you are for the amendment. This is, you have 4 for it. So if you're against it, raise your hand. Give me the number. Remember, we have 3 ex officio members voting in here today.
Wrong time to read a text.
15.
How many? 15 to what? 4? All right, the amendment fails. All right. Now, we have an amendment on the table. Well, I mean, we have the bill on the table, Senate resolution, or the resolution, Senate resolution 287. We have a do pass and a second. I have 2 people who want to speak to that. The Speaker Pro Tem, Jan Jones. Oh, she waves. Number 18, that is, he waves, all right? So I see no one else. All right, this time I'm going to call the question. All right, here we go. All in favor of Senate Resolution 287, please indicate by raising your hand. If you're for the bill, this is saying yes. This is yes. What do we have? 15. We have 15. All right. All against, please raise your hand where you can be recorded. And if you would, take the names in case they want to be. All right. How many do we have?
6.
How many? 6. All right, it's 15 to 6. Do pass, so it passes. So we have both. The resolution did pass. Before we go, Representative Dudgeons, you want to announce the 2 subcommittees that we have coming up and when their meeting dates. Representative Nix, do you have a meeting coming up? Representative Clark, I think, has one, and you have one.
Yeah, we have meetings at 1 o'clock tomorrow and 2 o'clock tomorrow to finish up the bills, academic innovations and academic achievement.
Now, remember, members of the committee, our last meeting will be Wednesday. Our last meeting will be Wednesday at 3. Thank you all so much for coming. All right.